Welcome to my channel of Gil Master Stories. Don't forget to subscribe button and press on the bell icon. For more inspiration and mind-blowing stories, she lunged at him in a fit of rage. The courtroom frozen in shock, yet he didn't flinch. What this lawyer did next silenced everyone and changed everything. The courtroom was heavy. You could feel it like air, thick with the weight of unspoken words. It wasn't noisy, yet it wasn't silent either. Papers rustled, chairs scraped against the polished floors. A murmur here, a sigh there. Everyone was on edge. This wasn't a normal case. People knew her name, they'd seen her face, plastered across every news station. Always attached to some outrageous headline. Margaret Brown, middle-aged, sharp-tongued, and unpredictable. She wasn't just indicted, she was infamous. Her outbursts were legendary, and yet here she sat, staring at the black attorney at the other table. Like a storm brewing quietly on the horizon, the lawyer Anthony Reed was her opposite in every way. He exuded calm. So steady he might have been carved from stone, tall and lean, with a quiet intensity that commanded respect without saying much. It was a defense attorney's nightmare to face him. Anthony wasn't just good, he was strategic. He didn't bark or shout, his voice was always measured. His argument sharp as a blade. Margaret's attorney looked nervous. He'd had the impossible job of keeping her calm. It wasn't working, you could see her twitching fingers, the sharp rise and fall of her shoulders as she tried to steady her breathing. She was restless, and then there were her eyes locked on Anthony like he'd already taken something from her. Court is now in session. All rise for the Honorable Judge Patrick Fields, the bailiff announced, voice echoing. Everyone rose, some clumsily, others with purpose. The judge entered, a man who looked weary from decades on the bench. He settled in his seat, glanced around the room, and then the trial began. Anthony was the one presenting evidence that day. He stood and walked toward the jury box, not a wasted movement. His polished shoes echoed across the floor, somehow sounding louder than they should have. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, voice steady and smooth. What you're about to hear is undeniable. Margaret gripped the edges of her chair. A quiet gasp escaped someone in the back row. Anthony didn't seem to notice. He was locked in, confident and focused on the jury, on truth, or at least his version of it. But everyone else noticed Margaret. Her jaw was set, her breathing uneven. Her hands balled into fists. You could see the pressure building. It was like watching a pot about to boil over. And just when it felt like everything was steady, it happened. The boiling point came in seconds. But those seconds stretched long, like time itself was holding its breath. Anthony Reed had barely turned toward the screen, displaying the evidence, a series of receipts tied to Margaret's case. When it started, a sound low, almost guttural, a sharp inhale that everyone heard. Liar. The word shot across the courtroom like a whip crack. Heads turned, eyes widened. Margaret Brown was out of her chair. Before anyone could blink, her face was red, her hands trembling with fury. Liar, she screamed again, louder this time. You think you can ruin me? You think you can stand there? And it happened so fast that even the bailiff was a step behind. Margaret lunged. Her movements were jerky but forceful, like her body was fueled by pure rage. She wasn't just pointing at Anthony now, she was rushing toward him, her voice exploding into unintelligible yells. Gasps filled the room. The jury recoiled. Someone in the gallery stood up, clutching their purse. Chairs scraped again, louder this time, panic rippling like waves through the stillness that had just existed moments ago. Anthony, he didn't move, not an inch. It was like Margaret was charging at a statue. His eyes stayed on her, his hands calmly resting at his sides. He didn't flinch, didn't react to her words or her wild movements. Get her out now. The judge's voice boomed, hammering his gavel like he was trying to shake the walls. Two bailiffs swooped in, grabbing Margaret by both arms. She kicked, she cursed, she tried to shake them off, but they held her firm, dragging her backward as her voice rang through the courtroom like nails on glass. You think you're better than me? She spat toward Anthony. This isn't over. You'll see, this isn't over. And still he didn't react. The room was chaos, murmurs turning to whispers, whispers turning to full-blown chatter. The judge slammed his gavel again. Order in the court, order. Margaret was hauled out through the double doors. The door swung shut with a hollow boom. That seemed to suck the air out of the room. For a beat, nobody spoke. Nobody moved. All eyes turned back to Anthony. The man she'd attacked. Anthony took a slow breath. His expression unchanged, calm, unbothered. He straightened his tie as if nothing had happened, and looked up at the judge. "May I continue, Your Honor?" You could have heard a pin drop. The courtroom slowly came back to life. But it wasn't the same. Margaret Brown was gone, but she'd left a mark. Like a stain on the walls no one could wash off. Whispers ebbed and flowed like static. The jury glanced at one another, wide-eyed and unsure. At the center of it all stood Anthony Reed. He hadn't moved much, hadn't said anything. Yet he was still holding the courtroom in the palm of his hand. Not because of what he'd done, but because of what he hadn't. The judge's voice finally broke the tension. "Mr. Reed, do you need a moment?" Anthony shook his head slowly, offering the judge the kind of calm look that felt unshakable. "I'm ready to proceed, Your Honor." The judge hesitated, his hand hovering over his gavel, as if to confirm everything was back in its place. "Very well, proceed." Anthony turned back toward the jury. His demeanor unchanged, but his words, they were different now, sharper, stronger. He wasn't just speaking, he was commanding their attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began again, his voice even but deliberate, "what you witnessed moments ago is exactly why we are here today. This isn't just a case about actions. It's about consequences." The jury leaned in. Even those in the gallery stopped fidgeting. Anthony's voice was low, his tone steady, each word measured like a carefully placed brick. There's a saying, a person's true character shows when they're under pressure. What we just saw wasn't a performance. It wasn't a slip, it was a choice. He paused, letting the words sit there. It felt like he was speaking directly to each juror. "I don't need to raise my voice," he continued, "because facts speak louder than anger. And I'm here to show you the facts." The gallery was silent again. But this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was deliberate, expectant. Like everyone there needed to hear what came next. Anthony turned toward the screen, where the evidence had been paused. During Margaret's outburst, he pressed forward as if nothing had happened, laying out every piece of evidence with precision. Receipts, transactions, documents, each thread tied back to Margaret. But the room wasn't just listening to the evidence anymore, they were listening to him. The outburst had given Anthony more than just control of the room, it had given him credibility. He wasn't the aggressor, he wasn't emotional. He was the man who stood there and took it, who remained composed when everything else fell apart. As he clicked through the final slide, he turned back toward the jury one last time. "This case isn't about anger," he said, voice firm but gentle. "It's about accountability. It's about choosing truth over chaos." And then he took his seat. The room sat frozen for a moment. Before the judge called for a recess, jurors stood, shaking off whatever spell they'd just been under, while the gallery buzzed quietly. But no one talked about Margaret anymore. They were talking about him. But as the jury stepped out for their break, the real question hung in the air. Had Margaret's outburst sealed her fate? The courthouse lobby buzzed with quiet chatter. During the recess, jurors filed out, some exchanging glances, but saying nothing. Margaret's outburst was the elephant. No one dared address. Reporters hovered at the entrance, waiting for a statement. Cameras itching to capture anything worth broadcasting. Inside, the defense table sat empty. Margaret hadn't returned, still confined to a holding room, while security ensured she cooled off. Her attorney, a wiry, nervous man with a loosened tie, sat at the far end, his head in his hands. He'd been handed the impossible, undoing the damage Margaret had inflicted on herself. Anthony Reed sat alone at his table, back straight, eyes skimming over his notes, as if the chaos had never happened. To the untrained eye, it looked like he didn't care. But those watching closely saw something else. Control. The jurors returned one by one. They avoided eye contact with the gallery. But the weight they carried was obvious. Margaret's explosion wasn't something they could unsee, and Anthony knew it. When the judge gavelled the court back into session, Margaret re-entered. Her face was pale now, drained of the fire that had consumed her earlier. She didn't look angry anymore, just small, her shoulders hunched. As she avoided the eyes of the jury, her attorney stood clearing his throat, as if it might clear the tension in the room. "Your Honor, I'd like to move for a mistrial based on denied." Judge Fields cut in sharply, his gavel slamming down. "Your client's behavior is noted, but this case will proceed." Margaret's lawyer sank back into his chair, defeated. Across the room, Anthony stood. "Your Honor, I'll keep this brief." Anthony didn't look at Margaret. He didn't need to. His focus was on the jury. "I could stand here and dissect what happened earlier. I could tell you what it means, why it matters, but I don't think I need to." The jury's eyes followed him as he stepped toward the center of the room, hands loosely clasped in front of him. "You all saw it, felt it. That moment wasn't about me or this case. It was about choice. When faced with the truth, some people choose to fight it, others face it head on, even when it's hard." Margaret shifted uncomfortably, her face flushed again, but this time it wasn't rage. It was shame. Anthony's voice softened just slightly. "You know who I am, and I think you know why I'm here. I didn't come to this courtroom to argue with anyone. I came here to show you the truth, and in the end, that's all that matters." He returned to his seat. No theatrics, no long pauses, just the quiet power of someone who knew he'd done enough. The jury's focus lingered on him for an extra beat before they turned toward Margaret. She didn't meet their gaze. She couldn't. The outburst had done something no evidence could. It had shown the jury Margaret's true character, but the verdict wasn't in yet, and everyone knew the case was hanging by a thread. The jury was out for hours, hours that felt like days. The courtroom sat half empty during the wait. The hum of murmured conversations bounced off the walls. As people speculated about what the jury was thinking, reporters swarmed outside, desperate for updates. While inside, Anthony Reed sat still, untouched by the chaos around him. Margaret, on the other hand, had deteriorated. She'd been brought back into the courtroom after the jury retired, but she no longer looked like the woman who had stormed toward Anthony earlier. She sat hunched at the defense table, her hands folded in her lap. Her attorney whispered to her now and then, but her face never changed, pale, hollow, lost. Finally, at just past 4 in the afternoon, the door to the jury room opened. Everyone rose as the jurors filed back in, eyes fixed ahead, faces tight. It was impossible to read them, but the weight of their decision followed them like a shadow. "All rise," the bailiff announced, voice cutting through the air like a knife. Judge Fields settled into his seat, nodding toward the jury. "Have you reached a verdict?" The foreperson, a woman in her mid-50s with graying hair and a stern face, stood. She held a folded piece of paper and cleared her throat, the sound echoing in the silent room. "We have, Your Honor." She handed the paper to the bailiff, who carried it to the judge. Everyone's eyes followed the piece of paper, like it held their fate. Judge Fields scanned it briefly, his expression giving nothing away, before he handed it back to the bailiff. The paper returned to the foreperson who opened it. "In the matter of the state of Texas versus Margaret Brown, on the charge of fraud and conspiracy." Margaret held her breath. Her attorney's hands were clenched into fists. Anthony didn't blink. "We find the defendant guilty." The word hit the room like a thunderclap. Margaret's body slumped, her head dropping into her hands, as if the verdict itself had knocked her over. A gasp went up in the gallery. Reporters dashed for the exits, phones already in hand, voices rising in urgency as they called their editors. Judge Fields pounded his gavel twice, restoring order. "Miss Brown, you have been found guilty. Sentencing will be scheduled at a later date." Margaret didn't move. She didn't yell or scream or protest. She just sat there, hollowed out, as if all the fight she'd carried had finally run out. At the prosecution table, Anthony Reed calmly gathered his papers. He didn't smile, he didn't gloat, he didn't look at Margaret. Instead, as the room buzzed and whispered, he rose and turned to leave, walking out just as calmly as he'd walked in. It wasn't about victory, it wasn't about proving anyone wrong. For Anthony, it was about standing his ground, choosing dignity over chaos, truth over anger, and everyone in that courtroom knew it. But what happened outside the courtroom was just as important. The courthouse steps were alive with reporters. Cameras clicked, microphones extended, voices competing for attention. Margaret Brown was let out through a side exit, avoiding the front doors altogether. Her face was hidden, her shoulders hunched, as she disappeared into the waiting police vehicle. But Anthony Reed, he walked down the steps with the same calm, measured pace he carried into the courtroom. Reporters swarmed toward him, shoving microphones in his direction, desperate for a soundbite. "Mr. Reed, were you surprised by the verdict, Anthony? How did you remain so composed during the attack? Do you think Margaret Brown's outburst influenced the jury?" He paused at the bottom of the steps, the crowd falling into an uneasy silence as he turned to face them. For a moment it was just him and dozens of faces, waiting for something, anything. Anthony adjusted his tie and spoke, his voice clear and deliberate. Just as it had been in the courtroom, sometimes people will test you. They'll challenge you, they'll throw chaos your way, and expect you to meet them at their level. But that's a choice. Every moment is a choice. The crowd hushed, microphones straining to pick up every word. Dignity doesn't shout, it doesn't fight back with anger. It doesn't crumble under pressure. Dignity stands firm and lets the truth speak for itself. Anthony paused, letting the words settle. Then, without another word, he turned and continued down the sidewalk, leaving the crowd behind. The clip would play on news stations for days. Social media would replay his calm response, turning it into a message that resonated far beyond the case itself. It wasn't about Margaret Brown anymore. It was about what Anthony had shown, what restraint, dignity, and moral strength looked like in the face of chaos. This wasn't just about a courtroom case or an outburst. It was about what happens when someone chooses to respond with grace instead of anger. Margaret's explosion had been loud, but Anthony's response was stronger. In life, we don't always control what people throw at us, what they say, what they do. But we can control how we respond. It's in those moments that our true character is revealed, and that's the lesson. Sometimes silence is more powerful than shouting. Sometimes standing firm speaks louder than fighting back. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to hit the subscribe button for more powerful stories and life lessons. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it today, because sometimes the strongest response is simply standing tall.